Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to every one of you, wherever you are. This is River of Living Water Revival School, and you are all welcome to participate with me in this session. Today we are going to discuss a topic concerning mothers. And the topic today is Mothers, Travail for your children. Mothers, travail for your children. We look and in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. After the fall of Adam and Eve, God responded to the serpent, and he spoke these words to the serpent: "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." So God was speaking to the serpent after misleading and manipulating Eve and leading to the disobedience and the violation of God's first law of righteousness. God spoke a response to the serpent and told him, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." So after the fall, we see that God elected a separation. God erected a separation between the serpent and the woman. We know that before the fall, it seems like the woman always used to speak to the serpent. And it seemed like the serpent was not a crawling animal, because he became a crawling animal after the curse of God, because he told him, "You'll be crawling on the dust of the earth." So it means that most likely the serpent was a four-legged animal, and it was an animal that was able to speak. It was an animal that was able to speak, and it used to converse with Eve, and so they had created a friendship. And so because this animal, the serpent, this animal was friendly to Eve, Lucifer found a way to attack Eve, and he was going to use the serpent to deceive Eve and manipulate Eve. So what we are saying is that we see a friendship. There was a friendship between the serpent and the woman. And so in this response, God responds to this relationship between Eve and the serpent. And it said in Genesis 3 verse 15, "And I will put enmity between you and the serpent. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." So God was creating a separation. So after the fall, God erected a separation between the two friends. And he, in fact, is not just a separation. He created enmity. He told the serpent, "There will be enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed." Obviously, if we go ahead, we'll see where the extension of this verse where God speaks about Jesus Christ. But now we want to look at this verse. We want to address this verse to the woman and her offsprings, to the woman and her seed and her children and her children and their children and their children, 4 generations to come. 4 generations to come. Because whether boys or girls, they are born of the woman. Whether they are men who become husbands, they are also children born of a woman. So, and that is why God is addressing himself to the woman and her seed. And he is putting enmity between the seed of Lucifer, the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the woman, 4 generations to come. And so God erected enmity between the serpent and the woman, between his seed and her seed. And they became 2 groups at war. So they became 2 groups at war forever until Jesus comes back. So the seed of the serpent is always at war with the seed of the woman. We know that this critical reference verse also spoke concerning Jesus Christ, where the serpent was told that the seed of the woman will crush your head, and you will bruise his heel. But this matter also follows all the seeds of the women, all the children of the women. So a curse was placed between the seeds of the woman and the seeds of the serpent. There will be enmity, which means that Lucifer and his seed will be following the seeds of the woman for generations and generations and generations. And you remember even in Revelation 12, when the baby was being born, the serpent, the great serpent, was waiting for this, for the baby to be born, so that he can destroy and devour the little baby. So we know that this battle is always there against the children, against the seed of the woman, against the children. So we know that even when women and men enter into marriage, when they enter into marriage and they even start having the children, we know that it is at that point when the war begins. And the war continues against every life, whether it is a young child, whether it is an old woman, whether it is an old man, whether it's a grandmother, whether it's a baby, whether it's a baby in the uterus. We know that this battle against the life of people is being waged against the seed of the woman consistently. And so God himself is also declared war. He declared enmity, and that means he declared war between the seed, the serpent, and the woman, between her seed and his seed. And God in this word is also speaking to the woman to remind her every day that she has an enemy. She has an enemy, an unseen enemy, who seeks to devour her seed, who seeks to destroy her children, who seeks to destroy her family, who seeks to destroy her generations, the nations that God has given to the woman, the nations that God has given to the woman and her husband. The serpent seeks to destroy and to devour this seed. And it is the responsibility of the woman to be alert and to be at war consistently. It is the responsibility of the woman to be alert and to be at war and to be engaged in this war consistently. The woman who is now the mother in the family, the woman who is the mother on the family, can never put down her weapons. She can never put down her weapons to say that it is done. This war is ongoing. This war is ongoing. For generation and to generation and to generation, mothers must be at war consistently. Mothers must be at war consistently, praying and pleading for their children, even for their generations, standing in the gap for their generations and for the nations that God has given them. We are going also to see this mandate given to the woman and to the mothers by Jesus Christ in Luke 23 verse 27 to 29. As Jesus was being taken up to Calvary, after he was greatly tortured and he was forced to carry his cross and he was going up to Calvary, many people were following him, and also many women were following him and wailing and mourning because of him. So in Luke chapter 23 verse 27 to 28 to 29, Jesus addressed himself to the mothers. He gave a profound command to the mothers and to the women. A large number, I'm reading from NIV, a large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, Blessed are the barren women, and wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." This was a specific command. And this was a specific directive that Jesus gave to the women and gave to all mothers of the world. We know that Jesus himself God allowed Jesus to come through the normal process of childbirth. God allowed Jesus to enter the family, the family networks through the bloodlines by being born of Mary. The teachers of the law and the priests expected Jesus to come from heaven and land from space. But God chose this natural process. God chose this natural process to bring forth his son into the world. And so Jesus was also born of a woman. Jesus was born of a woman and raised in the family. And so Jesus is critically aware of the structure of the family. He is aware of the structure of the family. He is aware of the need and the responsibility of the mothers to take care of the children, to fight for the families and to fight for the children. We see that Jesus being born through into the family experiences the natural birthing process of babies. The natural birthing process of babies. And he is grown experiencing the growing process of a child in the family and under the cover of the mother. But Jesus also being the Son of God, he knows all things. He knows all things as the supernatural Son of God. He knows all things. And everything was created through him. So Jesus knew about the natural and the supernatural as the supernatural systems of people and the world. And Jesus, obviously, we see that he was all-seeing and he was all-knowing. Jesus is the exact likeness of God and the exact likeness of the Father. And so Jesus, having coming from the supernatural system of God, he knows the authority and the power of the supernatural system that runs through humanity, the supernatural life and the supernatural streak that goes through families, through people, through societies, because it is within people. And they know its complexity. They know the complexity of supernatural dynamics, the supernatural dynamics that follow people through the families and through the family bloodlines. This is a very powerful force. This is a very powerful influence, which is known to God and it is known to Jesus Christ. And so Jesus and God would want us to know these things. And that is why God brought Jesus through the bloodline. He brought Jesus through the bloodline so that we may have access to this knowledge of knowing of the supernatural matrix, of the supernatural life and the supernatural dynamics, its influence in people's lives, its influence in families, its influence in relationships, its influence in people's ability to use their resources or to use the power that is within them. There's influence to work. And obviously, how violation of spiritual laws, how violation of supernatural laws of God, how they are capable of compounding people in sicknesses and even at death. So Jesus knows the power of supernatural influence of bondages, of hindrances, of captivities, of imprisonments, of curses, of spells, of authorities, which rule, control, and dominate people's lives on earth. So people's lives on earth and their expression is greatly controlled and dominated by authorities from the supernatural matrix, from the supernatural life. And we have seen from Genesis what God really spoke to the serpent. God spoke to the serpent that he put enmity between the serpent and the woman, between his seed and in between her seed. And so this is to mean that there will always be following the seed of the woman, forever, for generations to come, will always be followed. We will always be followed by a supernatural influence. By a supernatural influence. That because it would be an enemy, it would try to hinder and to control and to destroy and to steal the life of the seed of the woman in one way or the other. And so Jesus was speaking to the mothers, as the mothers and the women were wailing and mourning because of his suffering. Jesus was telling them, no, don't wail for me. Don't wail for me. Wail and mourn and weep for yourselves and your children. Weep for yourselves and your children. And so what we are saying is that Jesus is able to see what we as human beings are not able to see. He is able to see that which is hidden from our eyes, that is which is hidden from our mental comprehension. And Jesus is able to see the complexities in families and in bloodlines. He is able to see the power and dominion of even spiritual cultural systems. We know that many societies of the world are ruled by and governed by spiritual governments. Many societies of the world have their own indigenous spiritual governments. And so these governments are rules and regulations and laws by which these societies should live by. And so we find that even people in the societies and in the families are ruled and governed by these spiritual complexities from cultural systems, from spiritual cultural systems. People are also controlled by the authorities of spiritual intermixing in heritage in families through marriage of this bloodline, and these bloodlines come together. There are two bloodlines that always come together in marriage, and in their union and their bringing forth new children, we see that these are new complexities of supernatural systems and heritage that is passed on to the children. Jesus and God, they know all about this. They know all about the spiritual complexities. They know all about the spiritual complexities that are compounded from generation to generation. Every generation is brought forth by a compounding, as a more stronger compounding from the previous generations of the supernatural systems. And we know that this is why God himself, when he wanted to raise a nation for himself, God wanted among the nations of the world in the ancient times, there were people who are living before within that time that he wanted to raise a nation of Israel. But God did not want to take up and inherit those nations, because those nations, they had their own spiritual cultural systems. And so he did not want to take up a people who are covenanted and bowed by other spiritual systems. He wanted to create his own nation, and he wanted to create his own spiritual system that would rule that nation. And so that is why God chose to select a seed. He chose to select a seed from the house of Nahor, from the Ur of the Chaldeans. And he chose the seed of Abraham, and he entered into a blood covenant with Abraham. God entered into a blood covenant with Abraham. Or we can say that God signed a treaty with Abraham over his descendants. Although at that particular time, Abraham was elderly and he had not even had children. But God entered into a treaty with Abraham over his descendants. That means that God covenanted Abraham's descendants to himself by the blood covenant that he drew out with Abraham. God was signing a treaty, and Abraham was handing over his generations to God, because that is what God wanted. His generation through the selected seed of Isaac. With this blood covenant with Abraham in the Old Testament, which is called the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, God was entering into a treaty with Abraham over his descendants. And God was covenanting with Abraham over his descendants to himself. God covenanted Abraham's descendants to himself. Because even before a child was born from Abraham, even before a child was born from Abraham, God drew out a covenant of the seed that will come out from Abraham. And he said that those children from his selected seed are covenanted to God. So this family and this seed and these nations that were going to come from Jacob, all these seeds and the nations that came from Jacob were covenanted to God. They were not going to enter into any other spiritual covenant. They were not going to be locked up in any other spiritual covenant. They were only going to be sealed to God by the only blood covenant that he had sealed and had drawn out with Abraham. And so this was purposeful. This was purposeful because God knew how the peoples of the world, even after the fall, had entered into various spiritual systems. How people of the world and groups of people in the world have entered into their own spiritual cultural systems. And we may say that all peoples of the world are locked up in their own spiritual cultural system. But the people of Israel, the people of the Jews' extraction, are locked in the covenant of Abraham. They are locked up in the blood covenant of Abraham. And so they were not allowed to go and enter into any other spiritual system. And this is why God was selecting a seed. He was selecting a seed to raise a nation through whom he would bring his own son to the earth. And so by the time that Jesus was to be born, God was going to control and regulate everybody who will be within that bloodline. Who will be within that bloodline. And what we are saying is that the peoples of the world today are locked up by incredible force and power of the spiritual systems. They are the spiritual systems that follow people because of the sin of Adam and Eve. Because of the sin of Adam and Eve and the violation of God's first law of righteousness. And also because of the authority and the command of castaway and the separation of people from God. And people went out their own way. And people developed their own spiritual systems. And all groups and societies of people have their own spiritual cultural systems. And we know that this spiritual cultural system and this spiritual heritage of people from even the sin of Adam and Eve, from the sin of Adam and Eve and the castaway, we must also look at also the authority, the spiritual authority of the curse, the spiritual authority of the regulatory system of God, of the curse, also follows every child. And this matter is compounded from generations to generation. Because as two people come together in marriage, every person brings his own spiritual heritage from his bloodline. And the other one brings his spiritual heritage from the bloodline. And they come and they bring forth children who are also carry the bloodline spiritual heritage of the father and of the mother. And so these are the things that Jesus is talking to the woman about. When he's talking to the woman, he's talking to the woman to weep for you and for yourselves and your children. Weep for yourselves and your children. And Jesus was telling the women to never stop travailing. They must always be travailing for their own lives, travail for their own children, so that they can break the children free from the bondage of these supernatural systems. From this, we will see that all peoples of the world are born locked up in very tight spiritual systems. There are people of the world are born locked up in very tight spiritual bondages and controls and complexities. But the women, Jesus was given the command to the women that they must continue to travail over the lives of their children. They must continue to pray, to pray, to pray before the throne of God, to pray before the throne of God concerning their own lives and the lives of their children. So Jesus is giving here mandate to the woman. Jesus is giving mandate to the woman, that is telling the woman, by your action of weeping and praying for your family and your children and your seed for generations to come, you will ultimately effect a spiritual shift. There will be a spiritual shift in your children and in their generations to come. So God wanted to ensure a clean, manageable, and known spiritual system among the people, the nation that he was going to raise. And Jesus knows all this too well. He knows the supernatural and spiritual weight in families and in the individuals, every person and every child. Every person and every child and family is followed by the incredible spiritual weight. And this word of Jesus is life today. It speaks to the mothers today. Jesus was speaking over 2,000 years ago. This is almost 2,000 years after, over 2,000 years after. And Jesus is still speaking the same word to the women and mothers. Because even the spiritual compounding is greater, is more intense within the families and within the children. And in this age, every generation, every society in the world, whether it is the first world nations or the so-called third world nations, we will know that the children and the youth within the societies is followed by many problems. There are so many threats that face the children. There are so many threats that face the youth. There are so many threats that follow young couples even as they enter into their marriage. There are so many threats. There are so many threats. And if there was a time for mothers to pray and to bring their families and their children before God consistently, it is now. It is now. It is now that mothers, if you have not been praying for your children, if you are a young mother and you are not praying for your children, and you are saying they are retro and they are young, there's no danger with them. If they are your mother and your children are mature and grown up, and you are saying now they are mature, they can take care of themselves. If they are you are a mother and their children are now in marriage, and you are saying now they are okay, they can take care of themselves, you still have the responsibility to continue standing for your children, for generations and generations to come. Let your prayers continue speak. Let your prayers continue interceding for your children, for generations and generations to come, to break the spell and to break the yoke over your children and over the nations that God has appointed for you, over the nations that God has appointed to you. So God is also telling the mothers even today, arise and travail for your children. Arise and travail for yourselves and your children. And we know that the children, the seeds, the children of the women, both boys and girls, are seeds of the women, are children of the women. And even the husbands are the seeds and the children of mothers. They are born of mothers. And that is why this critical responsibility is being given to the mothers today. Individuals and families and societies have entered into spiritual upheavals just because the mothers are not in action. Because the mothers are not in action. And Jesus commanded the mothers, weep for yourselves and your children. Weep for yourselves and your children. And so the same word, we are speaking the same word this day to all the mothers. Arise and weep for yourselves and your children. We know that by the power, authority, and the legality, and the rise of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, We know that the blood transaction of Jesus Christ, the blood transaction of Jesus Christ, he became the lamb who was slain but yet lives. Jesus became the lamb without a blemish, who was killed on the altar of the cross. But he rose from the dead, and today he sits at the right hand of the Father. He provided the blood of the forgiveness of sins. And also by the right, the power, authority, and the legality, and the right of this death and resurrection, which drew out the new blood covenant. The mothers, all Christian mothers, are empowered with special spiritual rights. They are empowered with spiritual power. They are empowered with special spiritual authority to break the yoke of bondage, to break the yoke of imprisonment, to break the yoke of captivity over their children, over their lives, and over their children, for generations and generations to come. They have been given the power and the right. They have been given the power and the right to break the spell and to break the yoke, the spiritual yoke, and to shift the spiritual systems for their children and their generations, for the generations to come. We know that in most societies of the world, the women usually take a very low down place. The women most times are not even recognized, and the position of the women is not recognized. We know that in many societies, the women really have to be masked completely, never to be seen. In many places, in many societies, the woman is never to be heard. And also, you know that in many of the spiritual systems of the societies, the women were nowhere. The women were nowhere. And so women have grown in a manner feeling that they have no role to play, that there is nothing they can do within the society. They have no power or force to transform and change the society or change the families. But the Christian woman has been given a special bypass by the power and authority and the legality of the new blood covenant. By the power and legality and authority of the new blood covenant and the rights of the new blood covenant that was enacted by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Christian woman who has believed has been given a special bypass, where she can come directly before the throne of God, and travail on behalf of her family, travail on behalf of her children and her husband and her life, travail on her family and her family members, and even on behalf of her family networks, and be in a position to influence the spiritual status of her nations for generations to come. So we are saying the Christian woman has not been left behind, that God has remembered the woman. Through Christ, God has remembered the woman and greatly empowered the woman spiritually, supernaturally, empowered the woman with rights and authority and power through the new blood covenant to come directly before the throne of God and to break the yoke, to break the spiritual bondage, over her children, and her nations for generations and generations to come. And so with this, we are encouraging all mothers on all women to arise and travail for your children. Wherever you have been discouraged and thought that no change was going to take place, we today encourage you, arise and travail for your families and your children for generations and generations. Look ahead to the many years that are ahead and see the nations that God has given to you. See the nations that God has given to you. God is interested in all these nations that he has given to you. Just like he was interested to the nations that he was going to give Abraham through Jacob. God is interested with all the nations that God has placed in your heart. They are nations, woman. They are nations, mother or young mother or even a young wife There are nations that God has placed in your hand. There are nations that God has placed in your hand. And God is in need of these nations. God is in need of these nations. And He has given you the power and authority and mandate to travail and break the yoke over their lives and shift their spiritual inheritance. With this, we come to the end of this topic. Let us make a short prayer. Father, in the name of Jesus, we just want to thank you and bless you greatly because of this word that we have shared today, because of the word that you spoke to the woman in Genesis, and also the word that Jesus spoke to the women in Luke. You have given authority and mandate. You have also gone ahead and given authority and mandate to the woman through the power of the new blood covenant, to give her responsibility to travail for her children and for the nations that you have given to her. You are also reminding the woman today that there are nations that you bequeathed to her. You have bequeathed nations to the woman, just like you bequeathed nations to Sarah, just like you bequeathed nations to Sarai. You have bequeathed nations to the woman, and you are in need of all those nations. You are in need of all those nations. And you are telling every woman, you are telling each one of us women to arise and to travail for these nations, to travail for our children, and to travail for the nations. Because, Father, you are in need of the nations that you have bequeathed to the mothers. You are in need of these nations that you have bequeathed to the mothers. Open our eyes as mothers to see that you have bequeathed to us nations, that we may take possession of these nations and to travail for them and to covenant these nations to you, O Lord. And I pray, Father, this morning and this afternoon or this evening, I pray, Father, that you touch and encourage every woman, every mother who is listening. Father, I ask you that you fill her with a new energy, fill her with new impetus, fill her with new motivation to go into intercession, to start praying and interceding for her children, to start fighting the battles, to break the yoke and the spell over her seed for generations and generations. I thank you, Father, and I praise you because you are faithful, because your word is true, and Father, because you are faithful. In Jesus' name we pray and believe.